Good afternoon, everyone. We're just about to get started with our fourth webinar, the Regional Climate Adaptation Planning Prioritization. Just a few notes. You are using the GoToWebinar platform, and you'll manage the controls of the platform to participate in the dialogue using the control panel, which is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. It's a gray box, and using that control panel, you'll have features such as asking questions. We do have a large group and everyone is a participant in listen-only mode. So if you'd like to dialogue with us, please ask questions using the question box. We may send out links or reminders using the chat. We'll communicate with you that way. We are using a very interactive and fun platform called Mentimeter. We have a slide to remind you of that, but if you have an opportunity now to open in another browser the Mentimeter platform, if you've been with us in the previous webinars, we've used it, and that is at menti.com. And during the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to enter a code and be ready to answer some questions and participate in some exercises that we have. And again, that's www.menti.com to participate. The code that we'll be using, if you just want to jot it down, is 628285, but we'll have reminders for each of the Menti exercises. So we're ready to turn it over to Kevin Burns to get started.
Thank you, Edith, and good afternoon and happy Friday to you all. And welcome to this being our last in a series of 4 webinars designed to help us develop priorities and strategies to adapt to climate change impacts and be more resilient, both as a region and within our respective communities. By way of recap, folks, we are working on a regional climate plan with the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy in partnership with the International Urban Cooperation Program, a program of the European Union. The Climate Action Plan will include both climate mitigation strategies, reducing greenhouse gases, and adaptation strategies. This webinar is focused on adaptation. By way of background, our work is rooted in the Greenest Region Compact, the consensus sustainability goals adopted by 131 local governments in our region, including multiple counties representing nearly 6 million people. Our work is also rooted in the ON2 2050, the long-term comprehensive plan for the region developed by the Chicago Metropolitan Agency on Planning with extensive stakeholder input. In the last few months, we have been able to align our adaptation planning around the steps to resilience, a remarkable tool that is helping us organize and accomplish the formidable task of planning for resilience for our region of 8.5 million people. About this webinar, we have been especially fortunate these last few weeks to have the generous assistance and deep expertise of our colleagues from NOAA, Dr. Ned Gardner and Jim Fox, creators and champions of the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit and the Steps to Resilience. The purpose of these climate adaptation webinars is twofold. If you've been with us on any of our previous 3 webinars, you have been helping us curate the adaptation portion of the regional climate plan. We appreciate very much your help, and we have incorporated your input in today's workshop. The second purpose for the webinars has been to help strengthen resilience in your own community. Our resilience as a region is interdependent with the resilience of communities throughout. Today, we will continue to work through the steps to resilience, focusing in on options to build resilience and prioritization of resilience strategies. The work we will do together today will strengthen both our communities and our region. To get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Many of you have met these folks before, but by way of quick introduction, our workshop leaders are Dr. Ned Gardner and Jim Fox, who are at the forefront of defining how our nation adapts to changing climate systems. Dr. Gardner is Engagement Manager for the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, a clearinghouse for federal adaptation resources. Dr. Gardner is a spatial analyst ecosystem scientist, data visualizer, and science communicator dedicated to helping people understand and apply global change information for better decision-making. Our friend Mr. Fox is Senior Resilience Analyst for NEMAC and Fernleaf, a public-private partnership between the Applied Research Center at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and a private company specializing in community resilience solutions. Mr. Fox has worked with Dr. Gardner to create the Climate Resilience Toolkit and Steps to Resilience, as well as to apply it to many municipalities and regions. Our friend Edith Macra and Jared Patton are project managers for the Global Covenant of Mayors Regional Climate Plan. Edith is the Director of Environmental Initiatives for the Metropolitan Mayors Caucus. She led in the creation of the Greenest Region Compact and leads collaborative efforts to address Greenest Region Compact goals. Our friend Mr. Patton is an associate planner at Chicago Metropolitan Agency on Planning, where his work focuses on climate resilience, smart growth, and community outreach. Mr. Patton has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and Spanish and Hispanic studies from Earlham College and a Master of City Planning from the University of Pennsylvania. It's my pleasure now to turn over the controls to our friends, Mr. Fox and Dr. Gardner. Gentlemen.
Ned, you're muted.
Dr. Gardner, you might be muted.
Very helpful information to have. Thank you.
There you
go. We may be a little bit informal today, jumping in where needed and helping one another, because the people talking today are on a core team that are committed to following through on this adaptation plan. We're going to spend some time after going over this agenda and objectives, reviewing where we've been in the past 3 webinars, and especially highlighting the extent to which, the impressive extent to which, the resources in the region, the expertise in the region have made it possible to leverage quite a bit of information into an adaptation plan and your next steps. We have an extensive set. We also have some interactive exercises designed to help you understand the process for identifying options, prioritization, and we'll be reviewing some specific outcomes of other communities that have taken action, with the idea that you will learn how the resources that the Greenest Region Compact, the Mayors Caucus, the Global Covenant of Mayors Plan, how those resources can be leveraged even more in the future using the techniques you're learning through the steps of resilience. So we'll review all of that after bringing everyone who's on this webinar into the process. And we're really hoping that the decision makers who are on the phone, the elected officials, the administrators, will come away with enough understanding of the steps to resilience that they're able to talk with technical staff in a way that's very constructive, that they'll be able to understand why vulnerability is different from risk and why that's important in setting priorities about what to address. And then once you have a set of strategies to address those issues, how to prioritize what to do and ultimately take action. That's the focus of the steps to resilience, and you're going to hear that repeated many times today. We also want to orient the technical staff themselves to the ways in which you can use climate information to enhance your job role in supporting a municipality, the county, and the region. And we know that on this webinar, we have people from the Greenest Region Compact, CMAP, and staff from the various governments represented here. So to you, we're saying there is additional support, and we're giving you a window into the ways to use the techniques and the steps to resilience in your job. And for everybody, we want to be very clear that the Greenest Region Compact and CMAP have provided a very strong foundation and platform and set of resources for not only building a plan, but enacting it. So we're going to highlight the skill sets, the resources that are present in the region. And so we'll have Edith and Jared woven into Jim and my comments throughout. We'll be identifying some key strategies that explicitly address the priorities that we have all agreed are important in previous webinars. And we'll be applying the steps to resilience to really suggest that you take next steps. And you'll be able to have some tactical insight into what to do. So with that introduction, I will hand things over to Jim Fox to review the steps and where we've been.
Thanks, Ned. For those of you that have been with us, you'll recognize this graphic. For those of you that are with us the first time, this is the foundation that we're using. This is a risk framework called the Steps to Resilience that is in the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. For the past several weeks, we've been looking at the first couple of steps, which are explore hazards, assessing vulnerability and risk. And those first couple steps are really talking about addressing the climate risk in your region. What we're really going to focus on today are the other three steps, the traditional decision making. How do we move from the problem to the solution? And so again, that's why we're doing what we're doing here today, that you do the assessment so you're able to take action and truly build resilience in the Chicago region. So let's move ahead, Ned. That we, just as a reminder, on the first step, we looked at the types of hazards and threats that are impacting your region. We looked at how past weather events have impacted the region and how those are changing due to a changing climate, how increasing heat and especially heavy precipitation events have been leading to a lot more flooding as well too. Of course, you can't look at just the threats, you have to look at the things you value that could be damaged. And those are then the keys to what we're looking at here as we're really advancing along by looking at these next steps. Well, to make sure that we really ground this in what's happening locally, Edith is going to then show how these key points actually fit into the GRC context.
So thanks, Jim. So the Greenest Region Compact is really anchored in what it's designed to mesh with what municipalities already know how to do and what they are doing. So one of the things that I look at when I look at the steps to resilience and think about what the municipalities will say is, oh no, not another platform and a plan. So I really wanted to sort of crosswalk and align the tasks that are in the steps to resilience with what's already in the Greenest Region Compact for the particular steps. And that, you know, just the assignment of gathering a team of people who want to protect local assets, we already have that in our municipal operations. And the little numbers that you'll see here relate to categories and strategy items or numbers with the Greenest Region Compact. You'll see a little bit more detail in later slides if you're not familiar with it, but those are reference items that say this is already in the Greenest Region Compact under municipal operations, which suggests that there's an interdisciplinary team to coordinate sustainability and resiliency efforts. The idea of checking weather events and future climate trends, that's something that we've just added to the Greenest Region Compact framework under the section in the municipal operations about using data to manage your community sustainably. And then even just this list of things that you value that could be damaged, while that may sound like an intimidating task, in the GRC, we have a lot of references to inventories and assessments that are typical within a municipal operations. And these, again, I won't go over all the little numbers and letters there, but they relate to the land category. If you have an open space plan or a tree inventory, if you've looked at your tree canopy, if you've done any asset management in terms of your water assets or your rolling assets in municipal operations, if you're aware of or have an inventory of historic and cultural assets, we added a new one for creating, I wouldn't call it an inventory, but identifying vulnerable residents, and then quite a bit on water infrastructure as well. And water infrastructure, again, assessment plans, or if you're part of a watershed plan, this is the beginning of that list of things that you value that could be damaged. Next slide.
Yeah, so just as Edith was talking about, this is actually a screen grab from a video that is on the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit related to step 1. But the most important part for us all to realize is it takes all of us, the team of us as key stakeholders, to really be making a difference and building resilience. And this is the key behind all of you that are participating in the webinar. You are those key stakeholders who bring your resources and accept responsibility to build resilience. So this is always the foundational beginning of any resilience plan. Ned, go to the next study. To the key players, we then add the data and science. And we heard a lot about data and science, about climate and non-climate stressors. The data that's showing us how climate is changing, and that is increasing the risk from hazards, but also how we as humans, with desiring to have a place to live and work and play, we are continuing to develop land. We are having other things that are creating non-climate stressors. So things are changing on the landscape, almost as rapidly or maybe even more rapidly than the climate as well too. So we have to combine both of those when we're looking at this equation of what's happening now, what could happen in the future. As we move to the next slide, you can see then that we started combining.
Jim, I'll just add, this is one of the areas where the Chicago region is particularly well positioned nationally. You have expertise in your region, you have tools on a climate science side, and with CMAP in the mapping and use of these data, it's quite extraordinary. And of course, we've highlighted Climate Explorer, which gives you direct access to downscaled climate information through the Climate Resilience Toolkit.
Thanks for that, Bill, Ned. Yeah, those are incredible strengths that you have. What we then looked at is, well, how do you take all this data? How do you combine it? And as a reminder, we talked about this idea of climate changing, but really what it's looking at is how that is causing the hazards to really be increasing the risk for their impacts on things you care about. And so you can see in the slide that the key behind this is looking at how these hazards combine with these things you care about, key assets, to be creating what we call these impact pairs. And in the last several webinars, we've looked at 4 main impact pairs that are really important for the Chicago region. This extreme heat and health, the impact on people. And then you can see flooding as a hazard, but having an impact in 3 very different ways. Flooding on homes, flooding on transportation, which is limiting mobility, and flooding on infrastructure. So we take those ideas and move ahead then and really ask the question, well, can you accept the vulnerability and risk to your assets? And this is then what we're looking at to move into step 2, which is the next slide. This is then looking at this idea of, okay, now that we've got this idea that we are experiencing a significant amount of pain from this increasing risk to things we care about, then we need to get into the idea of actually quantifying what that problem really is. We look at assessing each of our assets' vulnerability and estimating the risk. Well, what does that mean? Well, we can actually go on to the next slide. That is review. We look at moving from the concept of exposure. How many homes and businesses are exposed to flooding? In other words, when flooding occurs, how do the waters rise above them? But then we started adding concepts of sensitivity. In other words, the degree to which these assets could be adversely impacted, and adaptive capacity, the ability to cope, and being able to quantify those spatially so that we can look at every structure, every parcel in the Chicago region and move from a typical map, which is shown in the upper left, with every parcel that is exposed to flooding colored in gray, to moving through sensitivity, which is a little bit of the brown color in the upper right, of saying which are most sensitive, the green colored map in the lower left, which is the ability to cope, to then be able to look at a map that is looking at a variable amount of vulnerability. In other words, every business that is located along this river is not equally vulnerable, that some of these businesses are really much more vulnerable and at risk than others. And so this idea of a quantifiable assessment of each of these factors to help us know where the problem is really the worst and where we need to be focusing our attention. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jared to be showing again this great work that CMAP is doing in your own region related to this topic.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Jim. So CMAP is a large planning agency, and we have a really high level of capacity for doing things like policy research and data analysis. We don't actually have the ability to implement a lot of these things at the local level. So one of the roles that we see ourselves playing in the region, both today and in the future, is serving as that go-between to connect local decision makers to the resources that they need to make better decisions. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to walk you through a few concrete examples of what that looks like. And I'll start with the Urban Flood Susceptibility Index, which if you've been following along throughout this webinar series, I realize you're probably tired of seeing because we've talked about it in each session. But we've done that because we think it's a really great tool and it's indicative of the type of work that CMAP sees ourselves possibly continuing to do in the future. So if you're not familiar with the tool, it's essentially a way of identifying the likelihood that an area will experience urban flooding. It's not a predictive tool. It's not meant to be used for regulatory purposes, but it is really great for planning level analysis. So it uses a variety of factors that are typically associated with flood risk, like the presence of sewer systems, the age of development, land cover, soils, topography, a number of other things to try to identify areas that are most likely to experience flooding. It's a tool that can be used at various scales. You can clip it to your geography and rescale it to identify local hotspots, or you can look at the 7-county region scales to get an idea of the bigger picture. The map that you see on the right-hand side of your screen right now is showing it at the regional scale. And that's really helpful for CMAP's analysis because we can look at some of the big regional trends. So at this scale, it looks like it's really tracking development intensity and density. And that's largely due to those factors being built into the tool. But there are a number of things that aren't built into the tool that we can compare it to. So one example is Socio-Economic Information. So during the Onto 2050 planning process, we sought to identify areas that were more vulnerable to social impacts and had significant equity concerns. So we did an exercise to map census tracts that had high poverty rates as well as high proportions of low or of minority or limited English speaking residents. And we did a similar activity for commercial areas to look where unemployment rates were high and where business investment wasn't happening. If we switch to the next slide, you can see where those areas are located in the region. And when I look at this, the first thing that I think at a qualitative level is that there's a lot of overlap here. And I'll try to toggle back and forth briefly. And you can see that the areas that are experiencing this disinvestment have a tremendous amount of overlap with areas that have the highest levels of flood risk. So CMAP decided to dig into this data a little bit more. And what we came up with was the chart shown here. It's a little complicated, but I think that it's worth spending a minute to understand because it has significant implications for our region. So what you're looking at on the x-axis of this chart is the level of exposure to flood risk measured by the Flood Susceptibility Index. So a 1 means that there's very little exposure to urban flooding, and a 10 means that there are a lot of conditions that likely mean that urban flooding is a significant risk. The green bars on this chart are showing the entire region to show what percentage of the region falls into each of those risk categories. You can see it's pretty evenly distributed with a little bit less at the high risk end of the spectrum. The purple lines, on the other hand, are just looking at areas that we've classified as disinvested or disconnected. And those areas have the exact opposite trend. You see they're really concentrated in that high risk category. And that's important because it has significant implications for our work and for our partners in the region. So I also want to spend some time talking about the municipal scale, however, because that's the level that most people on this call are working at. So the map that you're seeing on your screen now is for a small community in Will County. And this was an area that wasn't experiencing a lot of urban flooding typically, but there were places that were identified as potential hotspots, and that can help them prioritize future work where they're already planning to do streetscape or infrastructure investments. If an area does stand out on this map, they can use things like pervious pavement or rain gardens to try to get ahead of future flood risk and mitigate those impacts. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have this community where almost the entire area stands out as being high flood risk. And that tells us a couple of things. And the first, and what I think is most important, is that the people in this community, the village staff, should be talking to residents about flood risk. It seems obvious when you see this that it's going to be an issue in the community, but we know that urban flooding is something that people often suffer in silence. You know, they don't know, they might know that their basement's flooding, but they don't know that their neighbor's basement is flooding, and that their neighbor's basement is also flooding, and that there could be challenges with mold and mildew. So it's important to start those conversations so you can better serve your residents. And then also this tells us that a higher level of analysis may be warranted because the flood susceptibility index isn't granular enough to really highlight where you should be working. And with that, I'm gonna pass, I have a couple more resources that I wanna share with you because we've talked a lot about the flood susceptibility index, but we haven't talked about some of our other tools. So the map that you see on your screen right now is our conservation areas layer, and that combines a number of pretty significant factors like remnant prairie and oak ecosystems, floodplains, preserved natural areas, a number of different high priority classifications that may be more important to preserve at a local level. So we know a municipality can only really work within their borders, but we also know that natural areas provide more services and more value when they're part of a regional system and when they're targeted to really hit those high impact areas. So if your community has a limited budget for preservation and conservation, this can be a good tool to consult to know that if you invest here, you may one day link up to a more regional system. Another tool that I want to highlight is the heat vulnerability index. And this is a really exciting project that we're just getting started. Right now, we have good information about where extreme heat occurs, where our heat islands are. That's the map that you see on your screen. We have less information about the factors that contribute to heat. So things like land surface, surface cover and surface color, and some of those social vulnerability factors. So we're currently working to create a tool that can aggregate those things that can be used for planning work, not just today, but also in the future as our temperature conditions change. So not a lot of information available about this yet, but if you're interested, please let me know and I can connect you to the people who are developing this tool so you can be a part of that process. And now I'm going to pass it off to talk about Mentimeter.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. That's a very impressive map, a 53-degree difference between the hottest and coolest places in that small space. And that gives a really important insight into some of the ways that extreme heat can differentially impact people. So in the first webinar, we asked all the participants to rank these different hazards in terms of the risk that they pose to their populations or assets, resources, and so forth. And this graph quickly summarizes what was said. You can see right off the bat that flooding is the highest risk concern for the region. This is review, of course. That extreme heat, severe thunderstorms, and severe winter weather cluster as a high risk set of hazards as well, and that drought somewhat less so in a moderate risk category. But that is by no means the whole story. As I just said, conditions can change very quickly over space and time for a given hazard, and that heat map showed it very clearly. Well, it turns out that your perceptions of your exposure and your risk are also variable across the region. So I need to point out that in the background, we have a satellite image of the North Shore. That's meant as eye candy. It is not representative of the specific area we're looking at. Best practice would have been that I remove it, but I just want to flag for you that you're really to focus on this graph as the result of what people said were their greatest concerns. And when you look at flooding, all of the responses, virtually all but 2, ranked flooding as highly probable and a high impact for your populations, your resources, your assets. Even these 2 people, respondents said it's a high probability event just with moderate impacts. And that does indicate, that there's going to be variable responses and concerns about this hazard. As we move through some of the other potential hazards, we see more diversity of opinion. Extreme heat, there are clearly some people who aren't concerned about it at all, and maybe a quarter of people see it as a moderate risk, with 3/4 of people saying it's either highly probable or a high impact or both. And as a result, I think we can get some insight into how a municipality, for example, might be implementing action plans differently for this particular hazard. And as we go through the rest of the hazards, you see similar or complementary pictures. Severe thunderstorms, severe winter weather. I would expect a diversity of views on winter weather, especially for people who probably are well adapted to dealing with winter weather. If you live in the Chicago region, you know how to deal with the cold. You know how to deal with snow. And so there are probably municipalities that are better prepared than others, or county governments and so forth. And I think that this set of responses reflects that sense of preparedness. But still, there are definitely those among you who see severe weather as something you're going to need to adapt to. I will say that we in this webinar are not directly going to be addressing severe winter weather, severe thunderstorms, or drought in more detail, but everything that we are commenting on about heat and flooding has analogous methods for searching for options, prioritizing, planning, and implementing climate action plans. So over time, as you use the steps to resilience, the lessons of the rest of this webinar pertain to you, even if severe winter weather is your main concern. And I'll finish off here with drought, which is perhaps the most starkly interesting diversity of opinion in terms of concern. It's a very well distributed group of clusters with every cell in this 9-cell matrix represented. And I think we should have another discussion about drought in another context, because of this diversity. A takeaway that is very important for the rest of the framework and for the developing resilience option is that this diversity of opinion is very important in both understanding how to develop supporting resources and plans for locations that ultimately have different priorities. And we know that developing a regional plan is meant to support taking the adaptation action locally, ultimately. So all this information has been documented and is going to go into the regional climate action plan. So you see it summarized here, where extreme heat has the highest probability, highest consequence, and therefore highest risk. Drought is a moderate risk concern. Severe thunderstorms, severe winter weather. Now that diversity of opinion, although this is a moderate category, for some people those are high risk hazards that need to be addressed in their own action plans and implementation plans. And flooding is also a high risk activity hazard for the region as a whole. All of that was review. And I think it was worth taking the time, because you're beginning to see how data support decisions and that the human value system is very critical to this whole framework. As we investigate options, we are going to focus on the highest risk concerns. So at the beginning of the webinar, I indicated that this framework, the Steps to Resilience, is there to help decision makers prioritize what to address first. When you think about climate change, it's a very broad, expansive set of issues come to the fore. By going through the hazard analysis and the vulnerability and risk assessment first, it's possible to focus in on those specific hazards and impacts that concern you in your locality or region, which is why we've taken time to go back through those Mentimeter results, those survey results about what you perceive to be your greatest hazards of concern. So in this step, we'll be looking at how developing solutions that actually address the concern, and then see how other communities, businesses, regions, governments, etc., have addressed similar issues in other locations. The Climate Resilience Toolkit is built on case studies and a practical understanding of how to apply climate information in doing things, which is ultimately why NOAA and the Climate Resilience Toolkit team is so interested in your region specifically. So at the end of this step, we are going to provide a list of options that we're going to then evaluate whether or not you are willing to support them. I'll invite Edith to speak a bit more about the Greenest Region Compact.
So thanks, Ned. So again, linking back to what we already know and can do as municipalities, the investigate options step really sings to me and the work of the Greenest Region Compact, because, and I just have to share with the audience, there was a draft slide that said jillions of options, and that's in a way what the Greenest Region Compact is. So I'm going to back up a little bit and just explain to those who haven't heard this presentation before, it might be new, how the Greenest Region Compact was built. And its purpose is to guide municipalities in sustainable actions that are sensible and approachable, and is meant for communities of all sizes. It's to build capacity and be effective as a region. And to do that, we wanted to learn from, as we're doing this step as well with these webinars, is learn from our peers. And so we know that there are a lot of good sustainability plans that were already crafted at the time we did the Greenest Region Compact, including the work of regional and national organizations like CMAP's predecessor to On to 2050. But we looked at all of the plans that we could find that we could compare apples to apples that had goals in them. And we looked at 39 plans, 1,149 specific sustainability goals. And the process of creating the Greenest Region Compact really is a synthesis of all of these goals into GRC goals. And they're categorized into these 10 categories. We tried to be as streamlined as possible, but the tip of the pyramid from all of these plans that we read are these 49 goals that we found in the Greenest Region Compact. And Ned, next slide, if you would. So the result of that process then to synthesize all of the plans, and there's lots of different terminologies that are tailored for different municipalities. We look at county plans, we look at regional plans, but we created these overarching categories that are common to the way municipalities think and operate. And it's not unlike you'll see a lot of sustainability plans in the region. I don't have detailed goals here. These are the goal categories, and I'll get into goals in the next slide. And you'll see here, there's just a climate category. We'll go into that a little bit further in a minute here. If you could advance the slide, there we go. So that same process of synthesizing these vast numbers of sustainability plans into the GRC, we've just recently done as a result of this adaptation process with the adaptation plans that we found. And it's still new in the region. There are not a lot of separate adaptation plans for municipalities. But we looked at all that we could find. And then we looked outside of our region. So we looked at other cities, including Seattle and Denver, Evanston, Chicago, Park Forest have sustainability plans, Hoffman Estates. We even looked at hazard mitigation plans, including the county mitigation plans. We looked at the resiliency plan that was done for Chicago, CMAP's work, and again, looked at this vast array of adaptation strategies, jillions of strategies. And then we've now are proposing an update to the GRC framework for adaptation. So there are some specific strategies that we've added, and I'll go through both old and new ones, and you'll see how that's just an integrate and an update in the next slide. So revisiting the GRC goals, as I said, we did this study of jillions of options, and those created the foundation that's the framework, lots of options. The goals sort of floated to the top, and they're overarching. Now, what's powerful about these goals, these resilience goals, is the goals are what we ask the municipalities and counties and the councils of governments that support the GRC, 131 of them, and then the councils of governments is another 10. They've already formally supported these resilience goals. So again, this isn't brand new or another step that you have to do. We're already on board with wanting to advance resiliency in the region. And those icons, again, just refer to the 10 categories of the GRC. The little orange one, that's climate, but there's a lot there with the tree and land, and I'm going to delve into that a little bit further. The mobility one, the little bus there, that's integrating sustainability into transportation policies and programs. In municipal operations, there's a goal already that says collect and manage data to advance sustainability, and doesn't say resiliency, but details do in the municipal operations category. One of the most popular categories in the GRC is very broad, lots of goals, and a lot of energy around it, is the sustainable communities category, which looks at the GRC goal to foster a culture of health, safety, and wellness. And this has been really expanded as we've moved to update with adaptation goals. And then an awful lot on water systems, but particularly as related to our overarching highest priority impacts on the Chicago region is stormwater, and the idea of using natural and built systems or green infrastructure to manage stormwater. So again, my point here is that our region's on board with these goals, and we can just simply expand upon them and develop them to become, to move forward on the adaptation planning. So then the next slide. And then kind of back to my jillions of options here. In creating the Greenest Region Compact, we actually started with the strategies. And so what you're seeing here is a little snip from the page of the Greenest Region Compact framework. So the GRC goals that we just looked at on the previous slide, and all 49 of those, are what we put before village boards and city councils and county boards and executive boards to say, please support these goals. And that's what's circled. So if you look in the goal column there on the slide, what the village board, city council has committed to is to conserve, restore, and enhance natural features and ecosystems. The strategies in this entire toolkit then is offered as an optional tool. These strategies were used in the kind of identifying of those goals, but they're very useful tools. They come from, or very useful strategies, they come from a wide range of sources, including all those 39 sustainability plans, the adaptation plans that we've looked at, and then some outside consultation with partners as we were putting this together and as we've updated it. So the framework serves as a tool. It's a very popular self-assessment tool, particularly when you look at the columns to the right. And so if you're already on board with the goal, because your village board, city council said so, then you now look at how do we reach those goals. And so you can choose from the strategies, and there's jillions of strategies, actually almost 400 strategies in the Greenest Region Compact framework. And then you look at the columns to the right that will help guide you through prioritizing and choosing these options as to whether or not you're interested or whether or not you want to prioritize those. And Ned will walk us through this into a Mentimeter exercise. But I also have to point out the most popular column. The most popular part of the Greenest Region Compact is that already achieved framework. And there's no more delightful conversation that I have with a mayor who looks at the Greenest Region Compact and says, well, Edith, we've already done all these things. And that's the point, is that It's identifying what you've already done, where the strengths are, and then looking forward, where can you work as an individually, as a community, with things that already make sense to you that you would like to begin doing, and what can we do collaboratively. This is an exercise we also did for our first workshop and the mitigation workshop, identifying which are some of these strategies that are important to you as a community, but would be better and advance further if we worked collaboratively on those. So next slide.
Yeah, and just to build on what Edith is saying, that from those jillions of options that are the sustainability one, the resilience options are really a subset of those. And just again, as a little bit of review, the resilience actions are ones that really increase our capacity across our region. Because we know that hazards are going to keep occurring. We're going to keep having heavy rainstorms that are going to be causing flooding. We're going to have heat waves that are going to impact our people. And so we've got two choices. We can look at the curve on the right, a less resilient community that when a hazard occurs, we drop way off a baseline and cross what we call a tipping point. And tipping points mean there is so much impact that it takes us a long time to bounce back, and we may not even bounce back to the level we were before that event occurring. But if we look at the curve on the left, that what we're interested in doing is investing in this oval to be raising our baseline. These are the actions that increase the level of capacity or service in our community, so that when that same hazard occurs, we don't fall as far and we can bounce back much quicker. And so this is really what the whole resilience plan is about. We've done the assessment in the first two steps to really be looking at, well, where can we build resilience? And where can we do that with limited resources that we have? How can we prioritize those investments? Looking at the next slide, then, we see how this ties back into the assessment. That you remember these terms of exposure, adaptive capacity, sensitivity, response, and recovery, that we've got some choices. We can maybe buy out properties in a floodplain. That's reducing exposure. But by and large, you know, we don't buy out a lot of properties in that sort of area. And certainly you can't buy out a property to reduce exposure to a heat event. What you're looking at is maybe reducing sensitivity of infrastructure, homes, or more importantly, sensitivity of people. We can build adaptive capacity, maybe by raising homes above a floodplain, flood-proofing basements by changing the way that they're plumbed. And of course, the fourth option is, can we have a plan for more effective response and recovery through emergency management and fire departments? Can we, you know, make sure that we can bounce back through that sort of investment as well too? And so these are the sorts of things we're looking at here in this step 3 of the steps to resilience. What are these options that we can identify that can make a difference? So let's move on. I'm going to turn this back over to Edith.
Sure. So again, you know, making this connection between local concerns and coordinated regional action. The point here is we've been talking a lot about data, and Jared has been sharing with us these terrific maps, but just think about it visually in terms of the context of the GRC framework and the prioritizations that we've been doing on these webinars. Is we're all concerned about flooding. Most communities are experiencing it. There are a lot of local solutions, and then as we've been saying, Jared, Ned, Jim have been saying, is think about those solutions in the context of coordinated regional action. Work with your neighbors, or understand that an action that you might take using the data that we have, both in terms of impacts and plans, that they might be more impactful and provide a lot of the co-benefits in terms of regional connectedness, both for the functionality of green infrastructure, but even for the co-benefits, as we heard from Elena Grossman in our last session, about public health benefits related to connected, functioning green infrastructure. And so next slide. So I specifically wanted to move in on the resiliency to climate change impacts. So this is a goal that we have in the Greenest Region Compact, and it is being amended because most of the Greenest Region Compact has had a lot of strength on mitigation activities. We've talked about that in the first workshop that we had. What do we do to reduce our contributions to climate change? The resiliency, it needs some amendment, which we've just done with this update. But looking at these options here, these are priority options, both an existing one that we had, which is develop a resiliency plan using the steps to resilience, if I could say that, to plan to protect assets, public health, and to provide essential services that will endure through natural and man-made disasters. So that is a strategy that had been what we call an advanced strategy that we didn't expect a lot of communities to be able to do. But again, using the framework, you can think through whether or not that's something you already have in place. A few of our communities do, or if you're interested in tackling that. I also want to point out one of the ones that's a new addition, but strikes me as something that municipalities can do very naturally, which is really strengthen our emergency response among staff, our civic leaders, and allied organizations, and think about partnerships that can really boost our resilience as a region. And when it comes to collaboration and training, it's something that I think we have a lot of strengths as a municipality. I also want to pull this back to the priority. We've been talking about flooding, but I also want to pull it back to the priority impact related to heat and health. And any of these strategies that we're looking at here will have specific and targeted impacts on improving the health of our members of our community. Next slide. And so another area, interestingly enough, when I put together the Greenest Region Compact, I found that most every category we looked at had a lot on community engagement. And so it's really natural to have this goal to engage the community in climate change mitigation and adaptation activities. And as we went to go look at the other adaptation plans and do this update, we found that it's important really to share information and resources to support residents and businesses to help them adapt to climate change impacts and be more resilient in the face of extreme weather events. Next slide, please. So I feel like the share information is a strength for sure. And so the next category is, again, that goal is the overarching there in the green. That's what's already been agreed to by the municipalities formally. And I want to say this is in the land category. This is an area where we saw the most amount of activity in terms of what municipalities are already doing and when we read their goals from the individual plans that went into the GRC. So open space preservation is really the #1 achievement that we saw communities have across the region. So I feel like this is a natural one. Plus, it also helps address our climate impacts from heat and flooding. And so looking at these strategies that are already existing in the Greenest Region Compact, looking at policies that preserve and enhance open space, looking at tree preservation policies and activities related to sustaining a robust urban forest, or integrating the resiliency strategies into development policies and plans. Good to go, Ned. Thanks.
Okay, and now's the time to perk up a little bit, fire up your smart device, go to menti.com. You can also just use a tab in your browser. If you're on a desktop computer or laptop, go to menti.com, use the code 628285 and join our survey. What we're asking you right now is, what have you done to implement heat health resilience? So on all of the slides that you just were reviewing, you saw on the right-hand column a series of boxes that you might check. Whether you're not interested, you are interested, but you've planned to implement something, whether you've got it in progress or whether you've already achieved it. Those are the responses that you can give in 3 categories. So Have you in your community or for your county government, whatever scale you work at, worked to strengthen emergency response skills among staff, civic leaders, and allied organizations? I would say if you're having trouble reaching menti.com, you can put a chat message in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar control panel. Be happy to help people. I'm not seeing anyone responding yet, which has me a little concerned.
Ned, the
Okay.
link is in chat. So if anybody's having problems, we do have the link and the code in the chat.
Ned, you might need to reset that because I did go in myself and hit submit and you're not even seeing my response.
Oh, I cleared your response
Okay.
earlier. I will make sure that it is configured to receive. And I believe it is. Yeah, I'm not seeing anyone having. Jim, if you would please check it again.
Yep, I'm hitting submit and
People are getting an error code. In the questions panel, I'm seeing quite a few people saying that. So let's see here. I'm going to test it. Sounds like it's not working for people. All right, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll reload the page and we will, okay. Wow, interesting.
while Ned is doing that, the reason we're doing these exercises is to start looking at the variety of responses that we're going to be getting across the region, that all of you are active stakeholders. And we know one of the beginning challenges is getting us all to start having a conversation about what we value and what we're going to be willing to invest in. And to be able to have that open and transparent conversation to be building consensus. So that when we start going through these exercises, we're going to expect there to be some variation in the responses. And that should be that conversation that then is going to be going on with our decision makers across the region.
So there seems to be a technical problem with the website, which we've never experienced before. And I'm going to suggest that we continue on with our presentation, and I will attempt to contact the vendor to see if we can get that up and running. And if not, we'll adapt. So let's see, we'll just return to the presentation, and Jim, if you could just carry on with that.
Yep, certainly. Thanks, Ned. So we're going to come back to this, but it becomes important for exactly what Edith was talking about before that short commercial interruption, that we start looking at this concept of these options for building resilience. And when we look at this first one that Edith was talking about developing a resilience plan to protect the assets, you know, what are those things that we can be seeing? And to go back into the steps to resilience, then we can see as a partnership about what roles are being played. That for step one, when we started looking at the hazards and the changing climate, we're able to rely on those regional climate science experts to tell us what the data is really showing for our region and how things are changing. As we're moving into step two, which was again assessing vulnerability and risk, what we were looking to do is that detailed quantification of what the vulnerability and risk is. Where are we exposed to the hazard? How sensitive are we? What's the adaptive capacity? And as Jared was showing you, this is the role of CMAP in our region. They can be combining the data. They can be bringing those facts together. And again, it's important from the maps that Jared was showing us to see not only how big of a problem is this, but is it really a problem for your municipality? Because these problems will have a variable vulnerability and risk depending on where you live in the region and how these different hazards play out. That then as we move through into step 3, this is the key role that, again, Edith was talking about that GRC is playing, to be looking at the set of options, to be sharing best practices across the region for all municipalities to be taking advantage of that group learning. We've seen this to be successful in other areas of the nation, areas like Southeast Florida, which is experiencing a huge impact from a rising sea level, but other areas in the Northeast and my own home state of North Carolina as well too. As we start moving into step 4, which we're going to be looking at next here in a minute, that's then where we're starting to prioritize, which is also then going to be the other issue of what sort of resources do we all have at different scales. And so with that in mind, we're going to now start seeing this other part of step 3, which is something in business we call benchmarking, but it's looking at how others have responded. You know, what are some best practices that we know other communities in our region and nationwide, how are they responding to the challenges for these impacts from these 5 major impact pairs? And so to start that conversation, we're going to have Jared talk about how some communities in your own region are actually putting into action some of these options to be building resilience right here in the Chicago region.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. I'm having some network connection problems, so I'm going to ask someone else to control the slides for me here.
Sure, I got you covered.
Okay, great. So my first picture here is showing, so sorry to back up a little bit. Edith mentioned that there are a jillion options that you can do to address some of these challenges. And Ned mentioned that we have a lot of local expertise here in our region. So there are great examples of what people are doing to address these challenges that you don't have to go to, another country or to a coast to see. So I'm going to try to bring those threads together and highlight just a few of the things that you can consider implementing in your community. And my first example here is a place in the region where they have taken a strip of the parkway and converted it from turf grass to a rain garden. You may have heard that turf grass is the most widely irrigated crop in North America. And that's one of the reasons that I love this strategy, because it flips the switch, or flips the script rather. And it takes something that was previously consuming a lot of water and turns it into something that's an asset for the stormwater system. This is a strategy that we've seen in a number of communities, and that's because it's relatively cheap to install and it works. It has quantifiable, measurable impacts on stormwater management. If you can go to the next slide, please. The second example that I have here, sorry, I'm not seeing, there we go. Okay, so this is showing a similar strategy where you're having a rain garden with some other interventions in a parking lot. And this is a really great strategy because every community in our region has parking lots, and pretty much every community has standards for how those parking lots are built that are contained in their subdivision ordinances and their zoning codes. And there are many things that a community can do with just a few changes in that code to have a pretty drastic impact. So the picture that you see here has pervious pavers in the parking surface, and that's great not only because it helps with stormwater management, but it's also pretty loud to drive over, which means people drive more slowly and more carefully. But the really big thing that you see when you look at this is that great rain garden that's in that landscape island. And there are a few features of this island that are particularly great. First, it's depressed, and by that I don't mean that it's sad, I mean that it's below the parking grade, and that allows stormwater to infiltrate into it through the inlets in the curbs. So you see it's not a solid curb where the parking blocks are. That allows stormwater to first pool in the island, and then when it hits a certain level, it will go into the regional system. So that reduces the total demand on that system. There are also some really great trees here. One strategy that we've seen communities in our region use is setting standards for canopy coverage. So it's a pretty easy calculation for a developer to make. Essentially, you require that at full maturity, the trees planted in this parking lot will cover 30, 40, 50, 60% of the total surface. And that's great for stormwater management, but also for aesthetics and for Key Island. If you go to the next slide, please. My next picture is showing a concept that we're all pretty familiar with here in the region, which is a green alley. That has a similar effect as pervious pavers in slowing down cars and allowing stormwater to infiltrate into the soil. But it's really great for in an alley context because these roadways don't have as much traffic or as much wear and tear as a typical street. And also they're often in areas where a bioswale or rain garden isn't practical. You just don't have the space. So many communities are pursuing this option. Next slide, please. And this slide is included to highlight that not all of the strategies for green infrastructure are really flashy and popular, and residents don't immediately see them. But we know that we can't green infrastructure our way out of flooding in every situation. So it's important to invest in your stormwater pipes when you're doing routine maintenance, or if you're doing a full replacement. It's important to think about the demand that that area has today for stormwater management, and also what that demand will be in the future. And in many cases, you can prepare for that today. Next slide, please. The final example that I want to mention is one that's a little less obvious to people who are outside of the affected area, but can be incredibly impactful. And that's elevating basement sewer connections. So in a typical design of a home with a sewer, that connection is at the ground level of the basement rather. So when the city's system backs up, that water goes through the pipes and into the basement, and you get basement flooding. There is a strategy that you can use to address that by pumping that water off of the basement floor at the connection with the municipal system and putting those pipes on the ceiling of the basement. And that adds another 6 to 8 feet of buffer between that home and the municipal system. That can be huge for a homeowner whose basement is flooding with potentially contaminated water. Many municipalities don't get involved in the home too much, but I stole this graphic from the city of Joliet because they've done a lot of work in this area and they've had a rebate program. So there is a role for municipalities to play if their residents are facing these challenges. And I believe that's the final example that I have here. So I am going to turn it over for more Mentimeter, which hopefully is back up and running.
Yeah, so let's remind everyone where we are. We're looking at options. We're looking to develop options that directly address the concerns we're working with. CMAP clearly has a series of options for your local and county governments to work with. We also have the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. So I'm showing here.
Can I interrupt just a minute? There was a question that came in for Jared before Jared goes away. We have a question on where the location is for the pictures that you showed. Could you give us a quick recap of that before Ned continues?
Yeah, so actually most of the pictures I borrowed from Flickr. The Center for Neighborhood Technology has a really great account. And if you're interested in good examples, that's a great place to go. Just please attribute them to the correct source.
Okay, so they're not necessarily projects in the region, is that right?
They are in the region.
They are. Okay, great.
Do you mean specifically where they're located?
That's what I think
that is what the question is, yeah.
I am not actually, yeah, I'm sorry. These are not projects that CMAP has been involved with, so I'm not sure exactly where they are. Someone on the call might know, but I could not tell you, but they are all in the region.
Excellent. Okay, so there are also online resources for finding solutions. At the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, if you're interested in flooding and homes, especially indoor air quality, you might find yourself, you might find our pages that deal with the Great Lakes region and people in communities there and public health in particular. There you might find a link to FEMA's fact sheet on mold problems and solutions. So within that fact sheet, there are all kinds of solutions that deal with revetting the problem at its source, as well as preventing future flooding problems, as Jared has already gone into. If you're concerned about mobility, you might want to address the infrastructure that provides water passage under and around your mobility infrastructure. So culverts, for example, are very important to maintain and have the proper size. in a changing climate with more rainfall falling as extreme events, and with extreme events being larger, culvert design has emerged as a very important and effective way to protect the infrastructure that you have. So President Alsbury mentioned this in last week's webinar, that when there's limited budget, you certainly want to spend it wisely, and the return on investment in redesigning and installing appropriate culverts is a very effective and important approach to addressing the problems that emerge from stormwater management and its impacts on your transportation infrastructure. If you're concerned with heat, the toolkit has an entire dedicated website within it, and married to it and associated with it, called NIHIS, the National Integrated Heat Health Information System. And as part of this effort, we've documented for the state of Minnesota the way that the BRACE program has been applied to develop strategies that directly address heat and health. In his comments, President Alsbury mentioned heat and health, particularly for senior citizens. And so you might go in and directly lift county health program recommendations for addressing heat and health. So we did have a Mentimeter exercise designed to get you moving through some of these options, but it seems that, in fact, maybe that website is now up and running. So
it is up and running.
Okay, yep. Let's give it a shot. I'm going to have to adapt a little bit here and bring up the website. Hello. Okay. And let's go full screen, please. Full screen. All right, so I'm seeing some poll results from the previous poll, and it looks like, wow, a lot of mayors have really made progress on the emergency response. There's a lot of interest in the land use policies, only one person not interested, and quite a lot of diversity of engagement around resilience strategies and development policies. So that's excellent to see. This next poll deals with options that, whether or not you would support 4 different options for building resilience to some of the hazards and impacts that we've been talking about so far today. So the first question deals with culverts, and I mentioned that those are important for protecting, for example, your mobility infrastructure, but for many, many different reasons. You might be wanting to upgrade your culverts. In your stormwater system, Jared talked a bit about stormwater management, but this could be a large infrastructure capital investment that's required. So as you consider whether people would support it, think of all the benefits, think of the reasons you might entertain that. Now, we were going to talk a bit about cooling centers and splash pads in connection with the heat health, and with all the technical glitches, I kind of glossed over that. But, you know, in downtown Chicago, there's that famous splash pad. So I don't think I need to explain what that is, but is this something that you would maybe implement in your own community park? Cooling centers are places where people can go during a heat wave if they don't have access to air conditioning. And I can see a large diversity of opinion about whether people would support that. So understanding that level of community buy-in and support is a critical part of looking at options. Jim, did you want to say anything else about this survey?
Well, I think it is interesting that we do have a variety of responses, but also some interest here as well too. So I think within this group of stakeholders, there's probably an ability to learn from our neighbors about why some of these are becoming more important. I think I also want to just bring up for the lower two that this is something that is becoming a huge focus in the Southeast as we continue to see heat coming through. The city of Atlanta has done a great job of installing these splash pads in parks close to some of their public housing as well too, and just a way to be able to build some of the community culture back as well too, because as it's getting warmer at night, people weren't coming out and meeting with their neighbors as much. And with having these splash pads in the parks, it's really increasing the ability of neighbors to communicate with one another about what's going on while the kids are playing in the splash pads. And so there's becoming this other add-on benefit from this as well too. And sake of time, let's just move ahead.
Yeah, excellent. So I think you're getting a sense of how the diversity of opinion might need to be incorporated into developing stakeholder support. And that's probably something that the people on this webinar know about better than I do. So it's a critical part of moving forward. As we move into this next step on prioritization and planning, and Jim, why don't you continue the conversation from here, and I'll see if I can't do some more driving behind the scenes with Mentimeter.
That's great, Ned. Let's do that. So this is the step 4, right? Now we have not quite a jillion options as we did for sustainability, but maybe we've got a quarter of a jillion. And the question is, okay, well, we've got a lot of great ideas, but how do we start figuring out what to do now versus what to do next? And especially with the idea of limited resources, I think I could instantly take a Menti poll and say which of your municipalities have unlimited resources, and would get a pretty strong response of probably 0. But what we want to be doing is saying, where are we going to be able to invest to be able to have the greatest ability to be building resilience? And so the idea behind that is to start going through these options one by one, and to be seeing then based on different metrics about how we could actually be comparing those one to another. Probably the best way to do this is just by learn by doing. So we heard Edith talk about one of the main options that is already in the GRC plan for education and outreach is community engagement, and about sharing information to support residents, right? This is a big way that we can reduce uncertainty. So we've got a Menti poll about saying, okay, we think that this will definitely reduce a measurable impact and build resilience. We think it also fits very well with the on to 2050 goals and the alignment that we are looking at. But, you know, the question is well, how feasible is that? You know, is that going to cost a lot? Do we think that we could have a budget to be doing that? And do we think, you know, that there's enough ability within our own governing system to actually get this to occur? So this is where we want you to jump back into Menti and now start saying, well, how feasible is this? You know, if you think it's very feasible, you know, you're going to be voting in this first column, and we're going to be able to give it another green light sitting through here. But if we start seeing a lot of people starting to respond in some of the other ways, then we're going to be looking at this as like a traffic light, right? That maybe there's problems with this, but at least looking at what's kind of happening in the Menti poll again, and maybe if you could just pull that back up, Ned, and maybe we can get a few more people to vote. It looks like we've only got 17, but it looks like by and large people are saying, yeah, this is feasible. This is some things that we are used to doing as well too. This community outreach, that we can find ways to be reducing uncertainty around these topics by finding ways to communicate the facts very openly and clearly.
So Jim, I'm keeping an eye on the clock and thinking we need to kind of accelerate a little bit.
I agree. So let's put a green in that, and then let's go to this next question, okay? And the next question really looks at then this other category of response and recovery. You know, what about emergency responders? And if we look at this question sitting through here, what about, how about the ability for us to strengthen emergency response skills among staff, civic leaders? Okay, great. So again, it looks like we're getting some really good votes to be able to put another green dot sitting in through here. This is what we're looking for. We're looking for options that have green lights all the way across, because then those really start getting prioritized and rise to the top. But let's look at another one. How about developing a climate resilience plan? And we're going to change the column a little bit on this one. Instead of looking at the feasibility, we're going to look at, well, how well does this option actually tie into our 2050 alignment? And remember, the 2050 alignment has 5 major goal areas of community, prosperity, environment, governments, and mobility. So let's see what people think in this regard. Do we see? Okay, well, people are wondering about this one a little bit. We're getting 11. Maybe we can have a few more people weigh in on this one. It's kind of balancing between possibly, green and yellow. Ned, why don't we go ahead, and this happens quite a bit in communities. Let's go ahead and put a green and a yellow in that. In other words, the light's about to change, right? But we know that there might be some issues with this. And so this is probably one that we need to have a little bit more of a conversation off of. Let's go on to the next question. How about enact and enforce, land use policies that preserve open space? For those of you that are doing it, or those of you that are thinking about it, let's go back to this feasibility side. I mean, how feasible is it that we can actually look at land use policies that are truly preserving open space? This is the question of, what sort of support do we have from our constituents for really putting some more land control policies in place?
And
So let's see.
I'm imagining that this word enforce might be a trigger word for some constituents, and governance and coordination may in fact be an obstacle where people don't want to be told what to do with their property. Maybe that's just because I live in the Southeast that I say that. But.
Yeah, this is a little bit of an issue, maybe more for us in North Carolina, but we are seeing kind of this balance occurring, right? So instead of it being strong green, I think we're looking at a little bit more of a yellow. So if we would just look at even these beginning set of options that we're starting to talk about, the first few that we looked at were green all the way across. But as we started having a discussion about some of the rest of these, we then started seeing some of these having some yellow showing up. And especially if we started seeing an option really having a red light in there, then that would be something we know we would really have some problems with actually getting that to move forward. And so this is really the question. Okay, but let's now look at all of those together and do a final Menti exercise. And this is about the idea of limited resources. That if you want to then be looking at limited resources and allocating a budget, so let's say you have $100, where could you actually look at the idea? And I'm sorry, Ned, did I jump ahead one too many?
I think I got behind, unfortunately. And so I'm going to just mention, Jim, since I created a little bit of a problem there, I didn't have this poll open on land use development policies and plans. So
Okay.
people will have a chance to go ahead and fill this in. And what they can do is when they're done with that, they can advance themselves to the next slide. But those who are ready to move on to the survey that you're ready to discuss can also go directly there.
Right. So you can see that we really didn't get any very strong votes of red lights sitting through here. So let's just assume that we've got several sitting through here, but we also know that we've got limited dollars in our pocket right now. How would we start allocating dollars for really getting these things to happen? Now, okay, so we're seeing something interesting going on through here. And there could be a couple different things going on, right? Number one, we're seeing less dollars being allocated to education and outreach, but maybe that's actually the realistic view of this. Maybe education and outreach actually doesn't cost as much as some of these other ones. And so people are still saying, yes, this is important, but we also know that we're going to be able to accomplish more in education and outreach with fewer dollars. We can also then see these are starting to bounce around, and looking at then, you know, this idea of investing in several different options for really making a difference. So I'm really seeing a pretty exciting result sitting through here, that people are saying, okay, we can figure out how to be making progress on a variety of these different ones with the resources that we have. And just as importantly, remember, as an active stakeholder in this audience, that as a stakeholder, you're representing two R's. It's not just resources, but also accepting responsibility to do these things. And I think we heard from from last week, from the different mayors making their presentation, that we've got a very strong sense of responsibility in the Chicago region. So that's very encouraging. So Ned, I appreciate you driving that poll and leading us through a little bit of a prioritization exercise there. Hopefully everybody got a flavor for what prioritization will look like. Obviously we could only simulate that in a very short period of time, but get ready to be doing this, you know, with GRC and CMAP really leading these conversations for you.
Excellent. And give me a moment and I'll catch back up with you. I have to bring the presentation back up, which has disappeared on my screen. And
okay, so I'm going to keep talking. I'm going to keep talking. Well, okay, you got it?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Let's just make sure, Jim, that we captured those yellow lights accurately. Yeah. So we put a yellow dot, a green and yellow on enforced land use policies. I would call it green and yellow for the strategies for development policies and plans. I just wanted to make sure we had that right before we left this section.
Yeah, I think we had it right. The one thing that I do want to point out is we only had an average of 20 people out of the 70 that are attending, though participating. And so this might be a little bit of a sampling error as well too. So let's just move on, but realize that
I want to move on. I just wanted to capture that and review for people that essentially those were the two, the enacting land use policy and the developing climate resilience plan. Those were the only two that sort of had more concern about whether it was feasible to carry on. And that's exactly the kind of feedback we were hoping to carry forward, so that you develop a plan that is indeed feasible, achieves all of your objectives. And so we had a 3 objective set that we were comparing against. In reality, you would probably be looking at multiple criteria for evaluating whether your plan is achieving what you want it to do. So thanks for participating in that. In taking action, we've been documenting, as I mentioned before, through the Climate Resilience Toolkit, the ways that communities all over the United States have been adapting to a variable and changing climate. And we started this work well over 10 years ago, in fact. And at that time, most communities, like many of yours, probably didn't call it climate change adaptation. They called it smart decision making. And I think that's still an appropriate framing. And through the Steps to Resilience, we're providing more insight into how to use information about the climate system to evaluate changing probabilities of hazards, vulnerabilities, and risks, so that your options are actually going to be long lasting in their implications. So in the taking action portion of the Steps to Resilience, the toolkit is aligned with international and national best practice around operationalizing a decision, institutionalizing a system, communicating the value of the work being done, measuring whether or not there is an impact from, or I shouldn't use the word impact, excuse me, whether or not the action you have taken has actually reduced the measurable impact on the asset you're concerned about. So those are the reasons that monitoring, reviewing, and reporting are so critical in taking action. And you'll see many organizations that do climate adaptation really split those out as their own distinct steps. We see it as the integral steps for taking action. And that's what we'll be reviewing here. I'm going to turn our camera lens literally to Marcia Hilmes Robinson, who 10 years ago we interviewed in Fort Collins, Colorado. She's a floodplain administrator. And we're going to do a little bit of Friday afternoon at the movies for a moment. I'm going to take you into the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, into this case study about Fort Collins, Colorado. And as I said before, twice now, most of what we provide through the toolkit is information that you can learn from others who have taken action. And so this tells a story of floodplain management in a watershed that is prone to flash flooding in the Front Range of Colorado. And so we've in fact documented a video here, and we're going to show it to you. Everyone's going to watch at the same time. I'm going to have to adjust what you see on screen for a moment. And so stand by, and we'll be back together in this format in about 4.5 minutes, but I'm going to invite everyone to watch this video I'm broadcasting now.
That 1997 flood was life-changing for me. I saw the devastation. There were 5 people that lost their lives. We had millions of dollars in damage to homes and businesses. It took years and years to recover from that event. You can see Spring Creek, it's just a little trickle. You can jump over it on most days. But on the night of July 28th, it just kept rising and rising and rising. It was greater than a 500-year event. It was a big, devastating event for Fort Collins. The community really rallied together after the 1997 flood. And one of the key things that they were looking at was, how can we prevent this from happening again in the future?
Out of this tragedy, Fort Collins began to focus on building resilience. The city implemented many powerful approaches to prevent future disasters. One of their first investments was a flood early warning system.
This gauge detects the water level in the river and then can send us that information in real time. In 2013, that flood warning system was vital.
Additional gauges throughout the city and upstream high in the watershed give emergency responders a much better chance to help residents stay safe during floods.
In some places, we're going to build storm sewers. We're going to enlarge bridges to be able to handle the capacity. Other tools are education and outreach. Things like our bus benches and our notices that we send out to residents that are in the floodplain to let them know about their flood risk. The sculpture behind me is a marker, a high water mark sign for the 1997 flood, so that we remember that this event happened, it can happen again.
Flooding doesn't have to be dangerous. During high flow events, rivers expand into their floodplains, allowing water to spread out and slow down. Along its largest river, Fort Collins has set aside 2/3 of the 100-year floodplain as parks and natural areas. accommodating river flow within floodplains is a smart adaptation strategy. Detention areas far from the larger rivers and creeks allow people to experience wildlife when conditions are dry, while also protecting lives and property during flash floods. Though they can be controversial, regulations can be very effective. The city requires floatable materials to be secured, and they prohibit high-risk building in floodplains along the Poudre River.
The great news is in 2013, for our flood on the Poudre River, we saw very little material floating downstream. We came through the 2013 flood with no structural damage to buildings. That's a phenomenal accomplishment given that it was a 50-year event. It's important for us all to remember that these things from the past can help teach us about what to do for the future and how to be able to be resilient as a community so we can bounce back easier. Fortunately, our community leaders have been looking for the long term because we know that we're in an area that's at risk. We've been at this since 1980 and we've made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot more to do. We have a lot more areas that still are at risk, and it's going to take more time, it's going to take more money, and it takes a lot of perseverance on the part of the community and a lot of foresight to realize that these things are going to happen, they're going to continue to happen, and we have to adapt.
Some really excellent messages there from professional floodplain administrators who are the staff behind many of the governments that are, that you're familiar with in your local governments. So really value the insights that Marcia shared there. And if you'll notice, a lot of what we talked about today is incorporated into this case study. Emergency response and recovery, capital improvement projects, regulations, and the combination of all of those into ongoing plans. So that capacity to think comprehensively represents a municipality's concerted effort, literally over decades, to improve their resilience to climate-related hazards. And I think with good reason, this community is looked at as on the vanguard of thinking through how to address the worst impacts of extreme precipitation, because they were caught off guard by a severe event that very drastically impacted their community, even at a time when they had just installed new radar systems and new weather systems. And I think that facing down that problem that they faced is a really great example of principles of resilience and adaptation.
Ned, before you go to the next slide, there is a question that has come in that I'm happy to read out and then respond to. It says, regarding land use, we had two comments in chat. First of all, the city doesn't control a lot of land. Much of it is owned by the Park District. So for this question, then you're actually looking at a difficulty of implementation. In other words, a lack of feasibility. If this option was out there, it might show up as a red light. And how could we change that red light to a yellow or green? Well, that's where you have to bring another stakeholder to the table. How would you bring the Park District on board to say, okay, we're all in this together regionally. How could we actually do something a little bit different with some of that land? And the second part of the question, it says, in my community, spaces are almost 100% built out. Thus, preservation regulations have limited applicability. Well, again, then one size does not fit all, right? This option might be something that is considered across some parts of the region. But for this local area, this would be a red light in the ability to implement. This is something, if the land is not available, you really can't do that. And so a lot of times, this is what happens in this prioritization exercise, is we have to say, okay, for my specific municipality, that's just not something I'm going to consider. That then keeps reducing this from the jillions of options into now a very short list of things that we're starting to consider of what to do now versus what to do next. So thanks for letting me interrupt, Ned, but I did want to answer that question before we got any further.
Excellent. And we'll address some of the other questions toward the end here as well. But that was an excellent set of builds. I encourage people to go ahead and enter their questions because we will have some more time to address those. We've tried to make this very interactive, and we're very much interested in continuing to hear from folks. So looking back on these 4 webinars and the resources that you have, I'm left with a very strong impression that, like Fort Collins, who was thinking ahead and working hard over a period of decades, the Chicago region has a pretty incredible set of assets in place. Scientific expertise, some of which we tapped in webinar 2, committed leadership, as in webinar 3, where we know that the management of the elected leaders and the managers of the cities and counties in the region will have their eye on the ball and understand the importance of adapting to climate variability and change. And of course, the Greenest Region Compact and CMAP, and the expertise of the staff there, have all come together and are putting in place for you some great resources to not only have a plan, but implement specifically in locales those specific actions that are going to reduce your exposure, vulnerability, and risk over time. So the Steps to Resilience framework that we've introduced is very complementary to the existing capacity that you have. It's going to allow you to work across scales. So Jared spoke to this, and we could entertain this more in discussion, but being able to analyze regional patterns, evaluate how they affect counties and municipalities differentially, is a very essential part of allocating resources where they're best going to be used. And as Edith pointed out, how to scale up decisions from a municipality up to a county and a region is equally important, because the connectivity, for example, for floodplain management of riparian zone regulations, policies, and protection measures certainly influences your downstream neighbors. Issuing and responding to requests for proposals, the Steps to Resilience provides you a framework and a language to make sure that you're pulling in experts who can in fact help you advance your goals. So Jim and I work with a lot of local adaptation professionals in your region and are part of that network of people who can in fact work with you. And we're happy to make introductions when and where appropriate. But the Steps to Resilience can provide you a way to organize your municipality's solicitation for contracts so that you are sure that you're getting the information you need specifically when you need it. And as I said at the very beginning, the terminology, the framing, and the framework itself as a process from data to decision provides elected leaders, staff, engineers, and analysts all to have a shared understanding of what they are going about when they develop and implement climate adaptation plans. Before I move on from this, Jim, is there anything else that you'd like to add about the Steps to Resilience in the context of regional governments and municipalities?
Well, I think, the first point is key. You're already taking action. You've got great stakeholder support. I think also with looking at the movie on Fort Collins, you can see that this is work that is, you know, never done, right? I mean, but it does provide you a framework to iterate and keep making progress. And that's really the key thing is none of us can perfectly see the future, but we all know that we have to continue to be dealing with change, both from the climate stressors and the non-climate stressors. And by continuing to work together to support the quality of life in the great place that you live is the key behind all of this. And I think that that's what we're very excited about, because I think you're already checking that box in a very large way. So being able to do the rest of that is then going to be much easier with the type of stakeholder support you've already been able to bring to the table.
Great. So our team at the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit will be there when you're ready to take action. And we do hope you'll find the resources we pulled together helpful. We're just a phone call or an email away. A general email box here in the lower right-hand corner gets answered within 24 hours usually. We're very responsive to that. There are about 4 or 5 of us who monitor that mailbox all the time. And of course, the steps to resilience is the essential underpinning of the toolbox. So I'm gonna turn the microphone back over to Edith. I know we have questions that we need to address, but I can't multitask and read and deal with them. So I think Edith is gonna do some emceeing here, and we'll continue the conversation for a bit longer. But thank you everyone for your time and attention and the opportunity to work together over this 4-week period.
Thanks, Ed. I think you've done a great job multitasking. So appreciate your adept saving there and all the technology. We do have some good questions and discussion here. So we've had a couple of questions and input that I want to push on a little bit further, and then maybe ask Jared, even Mayor Burns, to come back on and then just talk more about open space. So while that's been a really popular option and a really popular goal for the Greenest Region Compact, we do have multiple units of government here, and most municipalities don't manage park districts. Those are separate taxing bodies, and then there are many communities that are 100% built out. So Jared, you too, and then is there any strategies for communities in our region to look at open space preservation, open space enhancement that that we just don't have direct control over?
That question's for Jared, I believe.
Actually, I'm going to pick on you too, Mayor Burns, because I know you've been in office for 20 years, and I imagine you've got some ideas. So
I can certainly share, and I'm proud to share with the folks tuning in, that the city of Geneva has a fairly rich history with respect to acquisition of open space. Those participating today from Kane County are probably intimately aware that back in 1997, the city of Geneva offered a referendum to purchase nearly 600 acres of land for, quote, forever preservation of open space. And the referendum passed with almost 90% positive vote. That land sits on our western horizon and will forever be open space. In fact, we have utilized that land, as it were, to make sales for land banking purposes, and have actually generated a revenue to the city. In addition, about 10 or 12 years ago, we passed ordinances with respect to infill development in our community. Like we've heard throughout the process today, a lot of communities are built out, and Geneva is one of them. We began as a community back in 1835, about 8.5 square blocks. Today, we're about 10 square miles. We're really not that big. So when development is introduced or posited for consideration, it's often about those few remaining places that are available, and how do we want to see those develop in such a way, considering the environmental impact, of course, and considering other impacts that have a direct correlation to the overall environmental challenge, whether it be roadways, whether it be automobiles, you name it. So it's a pretty decent blend of micro and macro approach. But in terms of open space, my philosophy has always been the more space that we can preserve as open space, the down river and down road impacts are just as positive as those in the community where that open space is preserved.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing that I really have to add to that is to echo Jim's comments about, there's a lot of great things happening in the region, but there is no one size fits all solution. So it really does come down to people working with their park districts, with the county, with the forest preserve districts, and really figuring out what works for their community. I think there are a lot of great models out there, but our communities are so diverse and so different that it's just essential to make sure that the strategy that you choose is the one that works best in your situation. And relationship building is how you get there.
And Jared and Edith, I feel responsible and proud to give a shout out to our friends at the Kane County Forest Preserve District and Kane County in general, because we do work well together. We have significant open space throughout the county. We're proud of that accomplishment, and we continue to pursue those opportunities when funds are available.
And I'm proud that we have 5 counties joining us on the webinar today. So
it's wonderful.
Happy to see that collaboration. And then Ned and Jim, I'm going to invite you to come back on camera too, because I think there's some things that maybe you can help us with beyond our region. There was a similar comment just about the collaboration for cooling centers. So we certainly have the ability as municipalities to work with park districts. I just wonder if anybody else has any thought about having cooling options for communities where, again, it might be a collaborative effort to provide splash pads or services or cooling centers. So a lot of good questions from Kim Stone in Highland Park.
Yeah, I can just tell you of a recent example from Raleigh, North Carolina, that the city of Raleigh actually partnered with several nonprofits to be looking at innovative ways to be providing cooling centers. So one of the ways was looking at an emergency shelter that was there for as people needed to evacuate, like for hurricanes, that was really being not used at other times. And so they were able to actually set that up so that it actually could provide the cooling center. I think the other thing was another city was looking at homeless populations. And homeless populations, there was always a focus on when it got cold outside to make sure they had a place to come in, but there wasn't a similar focus on as it got hot if they did. And so there was, again, a look at this idea of the socially vulnerable. And then thirdly, there was a view, and this happened in South Florida, from an equity point of view, what were the distribution of the cooling centers, and were they actually set up for true access for the people that really needed them as well too? And so this is then where equity and resilience have to be played hand in hand to be looking at the same set of metrics to make sure that you're truly building resilience for the most vulnerable. Hopefully that quickly answers that question.
And I think that in the time of a heat wave or any emergency, obviously adaptation is an on-the-spot kind of an activity. So finding multi-use facilities, libraries, and other publicly accessible spaces, they start to serve other functions. And so I think communities that have limited resources are especially interested in multi-use spaces that can serve other purposes where equity needs could be addressed in other ways, whether it's through after-school programs and community centers and so forth. So those kinds of efforts are what we're seeing emerging as popular nationally and could be relevant to explore, and certainly would require partnerships, as you suggest.
Yeah, and if I may build on that just a little bit, there are really 2 challenges when you're creating a cooling center or a warming center or any kind of center. One is to actually create it, but the second one is to get people there, because people are often really hesitant to go to a cooling center because it's not that bad, they can handle it, and what would they do there? So it's important to have programming, because somebody's not just going to sit on a bench outside of a municipal building for 8 hours because there's an air conditioner. They need to have something to do. But the branding really matters. If you say, come to our cooling center, that will be less successful than if you say, come to this like community outing that we're having here, come to this screening of this movie. just come to this bingo night. You know, something can be a cooling center, but not advertised as a cooling center. And I think you'll find that many more people are comfortable going to that setting.
Right.
So we've got some great questions in here, and it looks like we're running a little bit low on time to get them. There's one, and I want to call Mayor Burns back. This is just about collaboration downstream. So Jared has presented some lovely maps about regional priorities, but there's a very real question here, and I'll just read it. I live in a community that has creeks running through it. Downstream is where the flooding effects are realized. No actions on the stream banks have been taken in my village, only concrete wells to accelerate the water to the next community. So here's the question: how can accountability to upstream communities be addressed?
That's a beautiful question. The short answer is, I don't know, other than communities like Geneva, St. Charles, Batavia, Elgin, South Elgin, Aurora, North Aurora, all live along the Fox River. And we have, I would say, in the last dozen years or so, finally realized, respectfully, that what happens up north is likely to happen down south, and it perhaps might be exacerbated based on the behavior in other areas along that river. One major issue that's being contemplated now throughout the Fox River Valley is, as some of you may be aware, in other regions throughout northern Illinois, is the consideration of dam removal. Oftentimes in Geneva, when we experience significant flooding along the Fox River, it is the result of the dams being opened or the locks being opened further up north. And the sudden rush of water is such that we simply can't manage it, whether it be on the shores of the Fox River or, quite frankly, the spillover into our water and wastewater treatment systems. It simply becomes unmanageable. I think I shared a statistic with some folks a couple weeks ago. During the heavy rain events of about 3 weeks ago, our wastewater treatment system and drinking water treatment system was pumping about 4 or 5 million gallons, which is about average daily. After 2 days of rain, we were pumping nearly 22 million gallons of water in a 24-hour period. We simply out-taxed the system we had. So when we talk about improvements here, we oftentimes reach out to our friends in Batavia, North Aurora, and Aurora to at least share with them what we're contemplating, because we know that impact's going to seriously happen downstream, pun intended.
So I'm going to kind of close out the questions, but there's one that I want to pitch to Ned and Jim and Jared, just to see if we might want to go back to what's in the toolkit. So we've had a question about what might be available. We talked about resiliency in development codes, and beyond what we have in the region, I just wonder, Ned or Jim, if you might want to point us to some of the case studies in the toolkit. We haven't had a lot of time to talk about those on the webinar, but if it's we're just getting started on the region here, what can we do to learn from what the toolkit has put together?
Yeah, I'm going to answer first. We have well over 100 case studies, but in the U.S. Climate Resilience.
Pull that up while he's talking. There's kind of an open door there if you have the ability. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
So you have the ability to actually filter within the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit to actually ask that specific question. But what I'd recommend, just due to we are running short of time, is Edith, if you'd be willing to serve as the communication link so that we can answer that question and actually provide the detailed part. But there's also some wonderful resources in partnership with the American Planning Association for building ordinances as well too, and also through NIST. So yes, we do have some deep resources, and it actually looks like Ned's actually found one of them as we're speaking.
This is just one, and as Jim said, we could compile something more elaborate and certainly bring in NIST. This is a Corps of Engineers resource. As I may not have expressed clearly enough, the toolkit represents resources from throughout the federal government. And so this is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers building codes guidance that's built into their resilience initiative roadmap. But that's just one, and I simply used the search bar up here to search for building codes and found that quickly. but you'll find a variety of other resources. If you search, it's going to prioritize toolkit resources within that search, as well as other federal websites.
Nice.
And there are some examples of people doing really innovative things in our region as well. Floodplain overlays are pretty common for communities to apply a stricter level of requirements to areas that are more likely to experience riverine flooding. I'm not as familiar with this example, but I know Downers Grove has a specific section of their code that applies to local depressional areas, which might be more relevant to urban flooding, where if you're in one of those localized areas that's currently storing stormwater, or rather whether your backyard or some part of your property is, there'll be restrictions on building things like garages or other structures essentially treated like a floodplain. So that'd be a good case study to explore.
There's one final question in the question box that I'd just like to address in next steps, and that's just about where we go next and where we might get some additional input. So if we could turn it over to Mayor Burns.
Sure, Rita, thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists this afternoon. And we've been together for about a month now, every Friday. And it appears that every Friday has been beautiful weather, so almost ironic, as it were. But as we've gone through this regional climate planning process, we've expanded our partnerships to include many important allies who have and continue to help us prepare our region for climate change and to do what we can, where we can, and how best we can to lessen those impacts. We are grateful to many organizations who have participated in the planning thus far, multiple allied agencies and nonprofits, scientists from Argonne, the University of Illinois, and others, the US EPA, who helped us get started on climate action, our friends at NOAA, who have just recently joined, yet have made an extraordinary impact, and of course, a special thanks to the Global Covenant of Mayors and the International Urban Cooperation, who are giving us this unique opportunity and mentoring us along the way. I'm certainly proud of the participation we've had from our member municipalities and counties. 5 of the 7 counties have joined us throughout this process. We are grateful. And of course, multiple mayors, trustees, other elected officials, professional staff, volunteer board and commission members, and the like. And it may sound cliche, but ladies and gentlemen, while we are wrapping up this webinar series, we are in essence just beginning. And we hope that you'll stick with us, because I'm confident that the results will be positive and all of us will be able to celebrate a more sustainable region and a more sustainable Illinois in the not too distant future. Edith, back to you.
Great. And I just wanted to talk for a moment about sort of the next steps related to municipal capacity. So this journey really started with municipal capacity in the Greenest Region Compact. We're now involved in this really exciting, very brisk-paced process over the course of a year to develop this climate action plan for the region. And Jared and I do this presentation a fair amount, and we both talk about it's a year, it's an intense year to get this plan together. And when we set some regional priorities and some clarity, both for climate mitigation and adaptation, there are lots more steps for us to do at the Mayors Caucus to better empower municipalities to move forward, as we're talking about today, on adaptation, climate adaptation. So the intention is that the tools that we have that developed at the regional level will filter down. That there would be guidance in the same way that the Greenest Region Compact has helped so many of you on sustainability plans, that this that is aligned with the steps to resilience can help you with adaptation plans. We're also hoping that there would be some leverage for our degree of coordination and preparedness that would help us leverage additional resources from the partners that Mayor Burns just mentioned and new ones so that we can be more resilient as a region with the focus on the municipalities. And Jared, to you for your closing.
Yeah, so as Edith continues to work with municipalities to expand the impact of this project, CMAP will continue to work with municipalities as well, but we'll also work with our regional partners to scale up our impact and try to start some of those discussions about people whose work is more regional in nature. We also do see this as the first part of a multi-year process as CMAP continues to move this work forward through our work with On to 2050 implementation and eventual updates to our comprehensive plan. So just echoing what everyone has said, which is more to come, but we're excited to be a part of the process.
Well said. Jared and Edith, Dr. Gardner, Mr. Fox, and to all those who participated this afternoon, thank you very, very much. We look forward to our continuing engagement with all of you, and we hope that all of you will bring others to the fore as well, because the more we grow, the better we do. So with that, again, a happy Friday. Enjoy a safe and a lovely weekend, and thank you again for your involvement.